So here's the convent in Labida. It's down here. Oh, excuse me. It's down here. Let me point out, it's right next to Palos. Palos is the seaport from which Columbus is going to sail. In that convent, in Palos, you have a very interesting connection of religious, economic, and political leaders. All of them, from their perspective, want to see this voyage take place. Clearly, economics is involved, politics is involved, but this is integrated with religion as well. Here's a picture of the friary today. And here's one of these apocryphal pictures that tell the story of when Columbus showed up at the Franciscan convent with his son Diego, and they were begging for food, and the friars came out to help them. I would note the problem with PowerPoints often is you get what pictures are free on the internet, so you have to kind of work with those. I would just point out these habits should be gray. These are later depictions. The friars have gray habits. They're not monks. They're friars, which is a very, very important ecclesial distinction. So, he shows up here. Who does he meet there? He happens just to come at the time when one of the friars, who's a very famous astronomer, is visiting. This is an astronomer, a friar. Remember, since the time of Roger Bacon in the 1200s, there's a strong Franciscan interest in science and observational sciences, so to speak, astronomy being one of them. This man is also, Antonio, is also very popular at the Spanish court. So now Columbus, as you can see, here's another sort of apocryphal type of painting of Columbus with the friars talking about the shape of the world, the voyage, and different texts, apocalyptic texts that would suggest that this is their time. So you have Antonio, an astronomer. He's conversing with Columbus. And now Columbus has already done quite a bit of reading. This is one of the great points about Columbus. He really doesn't let the customs of the day keep him from studying what he wants. As a layperson, he's not really supposed to be doing some things. He does it anyways. And he's studying maps. He's studying especially Toscanelli, who has a different view of the world. And he also studied Roger Bacon, the Cardinal Pierre d'Alais, all who said that it would be possible to get to China, and the distance is much shorter than people thought. So Antonio is there. Juan Perez is the guardian. He's the one in charge of the convento. And he was a confessor of Isabel. In other words, Isabel would go to confession to him. This man is not a friar, but he was the current confessor. Juan Perez writes to Hernando and asks, can you get an audience with Isabel for Columbus? I'm not saying that the friars are the only ones, but they are one of the groups that are pushing to get Columbus in front of Isabel. They have a number of connections. And like I said, there is apocalyptic fever. This is rather difficult for some of us, maybe, to understand, but there were a whole series of prophecies. One, for example, is what's called the Vaimundo, that was written at the time of the fall of the last Christian bastion in the Holy Land, Acre. It prophesied how the end of the world would come. People took that text, rewrote it, and made it say that when the end comes, Spain will be part of that. And they put Joachim in there to confirm it. So there's prophecies that are circulating among the courts of Ferdinand and Isabel that say the prophet Joachim says that Spain will defeat the Muslims, conquer Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and bring the final apocalyptic age to come. Being cynical, did Ferdinand and Isabel believe that? I don't know. But they sure had an incentive to want to believe it, if for no other reason. And we are in a very religious time where people had the tendency to move out of their and work with their religion and their motivations. One of the things that came up was this way of calculating the time when Jesus was going to come. All through history, one of the things that is always a constant is every apocalyptic thinker is math challenged. In other words, every time they tried to do the math, if they happen to be around when it's shown that their equation is wrong, they go back and look at the numbers and say, I must have got a number wrong here. This was the current way of looking at it at this time. Jesus coming back in 1656. What does that mean? It means that we've got a lot of work to do. First of all, we've got to find a way to capture Jerusalem. We've got to find a way to evangelize China, and we need to do it quick. This all comes together at the fall of Granada. So 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. You've got that part down. But what also happens? The Jews and the Muslims are kicked out of Spain. Many of the Jews are going to end up in today what we call Istanbul. Columbus has been working for 7 years to try to get Isabel and Ferdinand to sign off on his voyage. The fall of Granada is the last Moorish bastion on the Spanish peninsula. This has been approximately a 700-year war, an ongoing battle in the Spanish peninsula over a 700-year period, where sometimes some Muslims are fighting together with the Christians against other Christians, sometimes Christians are fighting against other Christians, Muslims are fighting back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, a 700-year period of fighting. It finally comes to a conclusion in one of the most beautiful spots, if you ever get the chance to go to the Alhambra in Spain, one of the most beautiful places in the world. It comes to an end. From Columbus's writings, and this is one of the things that I'd like to underline here. A lot of people, when they talk about Columbus, actually don't read what he wrote. And he wrote quite a bit. One of the things that he talks about is when he was at the surrender. He saw the Moors surrender to the Spanish. He had been working, like I said, for 7 years trying to give them information about what he wanted to do. This is what he had claimed he was going to do. He was going to go across the ocean sea. He was going to evangelize the Great Khan, the leader of China. And remember, Franciscans had been in China now already for 2 centuries. There had been Nestorian Christians who had been in China much earlier than that. So there was a Christian presence in China. The Khan had indicated at a certain period of time that he was open to it. Christians needed to get to him. Going to evangelize the Great Khan. And Columbus now starts to think that he's the messenger. As you follow his 4 voyages, he becomes more and more convinced that, in fact, he's the chosen one to conclude this mission. So this is what we're looking at this point in time. Here's one of the maps, Toscanelli. You can see how this is set up. This is one of the driving ideas of Columbus. Here's Europe. Of course, Africa is being explored primarily by the Portuguese. Here's what we would call modern-day Japan, and here's Cathay, China. This was the map of Toscanelli. Japan was mentioned by Marco Polo. When he went to visit China, he talked about this island, great island, out in the water. So this is what Columbus is thinking he can do. He can come down, pick up the winds by the Canary, and come this way. What is he going to do? He's going to meet with the Khan, that's represented here, and also meet with a mysterious man called Prester John. Prester John is a fable that was extremely popular in the Middle Ages. It was this king who was both the king and a priest, holy, perfect, fair, just. Right now already, you know that's got to be a myth, okay? It doesn't happen that often. But it was an important story for Christians to believe that there was someone out there that could finally help them against the Muslims and the Mongols. Christians love to tell these stories. You have to understand the situation of Christianity in the Middle Ages. How can you be a religion? How can you be a religion that claims that your God is the only true God, you have the only inspired religious texts, but you're being beaten constantly by a superior culture, which we call Islamic? How can that be? We should be winning. We should be superior. We know the experience of the Crusaders. They go, sometimes by brute force, they win the battle, but they realize this is a far superior culture than where we came from. How do we do that? How do we work with that? I thought we were the best. We're the chosen people. So stories abounded. My favorite one by far is a story that a colleague told me from Germany who got into one of the Vatican libraries and found a manuscript. In this manuscript, it tells the story of why Christians really shouldn't be worried about Muhammad. Because the story that was told is this. Muhammad was actually a Christian bishop in Spain. Very wonderful bishop. He was next in line for the papacy. But because there was some papal intrigue, some things going on, if you don't believe me, if you've been watching the series The Borgias, you understand what I'm talking about. There's papal intrigue. He doesn't get the papacy, so he goes back to Spain, crosses by Gibraltar, goes back to Africa, goes down to Saudi Arabia, and starts his own religion. Now we can feel better about being whipped by the Muslims because really their best guy is one of ours. And it's our fault that we did that. That's our fault. It's really not that they are superior or better. It's just we didn't promote the right guy, and now we're missing and paying for it. What Columbus writes about is using his prophets for the conquest of Jerusalem. He's very clear on a number of different places. Matter of fact, in one of his last wills before he died, he asked that some of his financial resources be placed in a bank in Genoa to finance the final crusade against Jerusalem. So we know that this was something very important to him. Now, think about this. You've got Granada is captured. The final crusade, the final reconquista, is Jerusalem. Now we're free to go to Jerusalem. Columbus saw the New World really as a gateway to the Old World. Okay. When he goes, he doesn't find a New World. He finds the Old World that he expected. And it takes him a while to actually realize, if he ever did, there was actually a New World. Here's another quote from, this takes place during his third voyage. You can see, look at this. The abbot Joachim said he who should do this was to come from Spain. Columbus is still convinced that Spain will retake Jerusalem, and he's part of that process.